My name is Rachel, and for many years, I was Eric's obedient wife. Our marriage, which initially seemed built on promises of eternal love and respect, quickly became a prison of humiliation. Every day, I felt the world crumbling around me, trapped in ruins of a life that only I seemed to recognize. Eric, an ambitious and self-centered man, revealed his true nature just months after our wedding. At first, I blamed myself for not noticing, thinking I'd been too caught up in the dream of a life with him to heed the warning signs. But I couldn't keep deceiving myself forever. He gradually stopped seeing me as a partner and began treating me as a convenient tool to maintain appearances. I felt like an invisible presence in the luxurious, shallow world he'd built for himself. Our apartment in the heart of the city, a constant reminder of his social status and economic success, was to me the very embodiment of unhappiness. It was there that I felt most alone, surrounded by walls that echoed Eric's contempt. And then there was his mother, Kathy. Oh, Kathy, a woman as cruel as a puppeteer, who made it clear from the start that I wasn't good enough for her precious son. Kathy saw me as an obstacle, a hindrance to Eric living the life she thought he deserved. She would repeatedly say that her son deserved the best, looking me up and down as if I were something that could be discarded at any moment. And you, she'd say, you're far from the best, her words sharp as knives, cutting into my self-esteem. And Eric, he stood by, absorbing every word like a sponge, inflating his already bloated ego. As time passed, their criticism and insults became more frequent and more cruel. "You're useless, Rachel," he'd say to me in dry, harsh tones, as if speaking to someone of no value. "All you're good at is spending my money," he'd say, and I'd try to hold back my tears. I told myself that someday he'd understand my worth, that someday he'd look at me and see the woman he'd promised to love. But the words that came out of his mouth only magnified the emptiness inside me. The more I tried to please him, to be the wife he expected, the more I lost myself. And then Jasmine appeared. Jasmine had everything I didn't. Young, attractive, and ambitious, she swept into our lives like a hurricane, destroying any trace of stability I was still trying to maintain. At first, I tried to ignore it. I tried to convince myself that Eric's glances at her meant nothing, that the whispered conversations and exchanges of laughter, the excuses for coming home late, were just products of my anxiety. But the truth soon became undeniable. The truth hit me like a ton of bricks. Eric was having an affair, and Jasmine had become the new center of his life. What hurt the most wasn't the betrayal itself, but how Eric didn't even try to hide it. He and Jasmine flaunted their affection right in front of me at social events, during dinners, and even in our own apartment, as if rubbing salt in my wounds. While I shrank into corners like an invisible ghost, they laughed and enjoyed themselves. As if I didn't exist, their happiness a cruel mockery of my pain. But that wasn't even the worst part. Kathy, rather than condemning her son's behavior, seemed to approve of it with a satisfaction that made my stomach turn. Her attitude pushed me deeper into the abyss of despair where I was already drowning. I'll never forget that particular dinner night, etched in my memory like a scar that wouldn't heal. Kathy fixed me with a malicious stare and, with the most venomous smile I'd ever seen, told me that Jasmine was everything I wasn't: young, beautiful, ambitious, and worthy of her son. The pleasure in her voice as she delivered those words made me physically shiver, each syllable feeling like another nail in my coffin. Her words felt like a judge's gavel, condemning me to a pit so deep I might never climb out. I was cornered, trapped like an animal with nowhere to run. I had become a prisoner in a marriage that had become unrecognizable, devoid of love or respect. With each new insult from Eric and Kathy, I questioned how much more I could endure. I wondered if there was a breaking point, a limit to human endurance. I kept hoping they would see me as a human being, someone with feelings and dignity, but that hope grew dimmer each day. What I didn't know then was that the worst was yet to come. Eric and Kathy were preparing their final blow. It would either destroy me completely or, unknowingly to them, give me the strength I needed to change the course of my life forever. After that night when Kathy reminded me of my worthlessness, something shifted inside me. Something had changed, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. Perhaps it was the weight of years of accumulated exhaustion, or maybe I was finally accepting that Eric would never again be the man I had once loved. Either way, I kept going through the motions, pretending everything was fine. But inside, I was like a volcano ready to erupt. Everything truly began to unravel on a humid afternoon. I was arranging a vase I had bought earlier when I heard our apartment door suddenly open. It was Eric, home earlier than usual. I looked at him in surprise, but immediately noticed something was different. His usually cold, indifferent face was lit up with an emotion I hadn't seen in years. At least, not directed at me. My heart was pounding wildly as a fleeting moment of hope crossed my mind, thinking this might be the beginning of something good. Eric could barely contain his excitement as he called out my name. He said he had wonderful news for me. A spark of hope that had been resisting deep inside me suddenly blazed stronger. Maybe, just maybe, this would be something for us both. Perhaps he had finally realized our marriage needed a break, a fresh start. Taking a deep breath, I asked if we would be spending more time together. The smile vanished from his face in an instant, replaced by an expression of pure disbelief. He laughed, but it wasn't a light-hearted laugh. It was cold and cruel, cutting through me like a winter wind. He told me not to be ridiculous, shaking his head as if I just asked the most absurd question in the world. Then came the blow. He was going to the Caribbean for 2 weeks with Jasmine and his mother. It felt like a punch to my stomach. The words echoed in my head, but my body remained frozen, unresponsive. Everything felt distant, as if I was watching this happen to someone else. I could feel reality crumbling around me, but I needed answers. I needed to understand. But what about me? I stammered, trying to maintain what little dignity I had left, my voice weak and barely above a whisper. What else could I have said? How could I possibly accept that he was going on vacation with his mistress and mother, leaving me behind? Just then, Kathy emerged from the kitchen like a lurking shadow, as she always did. She began with her usual condescending tone, making my blood boil. She reminded me that someone had to take care of my father-in-law, who was bedridden and needed constant care. I stared at them, both in utter disbelief. Was this really happening? Was I expected to care for Eric's father Paul while they enjoyed their tropical paradise? This was what my life had come to. While they escaped to their life of luxury and pleasure, I was to become a nurse to a man I barely knew. The last words escaped like a whisper, as if releasing the pain that was eating away at my heart. Eric just shrugged, completely indifferent to my shock and pain. Eric's cruel words cut deep as he told me I had no other value except to be useful in this way. The tears I had held back for so long finally began to silently stream down my cheeks. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but the words remained trapped in my throat. It felt as if all my fighting spirit had suddenly drained away. Kathy interrupted with her usual contempt, telling me not to be so dramatic. She said it was just 2 weeks, and it's not like I had anything else to do anyway. In that moment, something inside me broke. I couldn't tell if it was from being repeatedly told I was worthless, or from the exhaustion of being treated like a mere prop in Eric's life, but for the first time in years, I felt a spark of defiance. I felt a flame beginning to burn in the depths of my soul. I started to consider what would happen if I refused, but Eric beat me to it. As if reading my thoughts, he told me that if I refused, I could pack my bags and leave. He added that Jasmine would be more than happy to take my place in every way. The threat was crystal clear. I had nowhere to go, no money, and no family to support me. Eric had orchestrated this over the years. He had systematically isolated me, destroying every connection I had to the outside world. Completely defeated, all I could do was nod silently. What else could I have done? I no longer had the strength to fight against the cruel reality of my life. The following days passed in a fog of humiliation. I had to watch Eric and Kathy pack while cheerfully discussing the restaurants they would visit and the sights they planned to see. Jasmine frequently appeared to help, her presence a constant reminder of my supposed inadequacy. It felt as if life itself was mocking me. On the day of their departure, I stood in the doorway watching them load their luggage into the taxi. Kathy reminded me, in her condescending tone, not to forget her father-in-law's medication every 4 hours. She warned me not to do anything foolish while they were gone. Eric didn't even bother with a proper goodbye. He merely made a dismissive gesture in my direction before getting into the taxi, his attention completely focused on Jasmine. Jasmine was laughing at something he whispered in her ear. As I watched the taxi drive away, I felt a mixed emotion of relief and despair. For 2 weeks, I would be free from their suffocating presence, yet at the same time, I would be alone, caring for a man I barely knew and who probably despised me, just as much as the rest of the family did. Exhausted and disheartened, I closed the door and made my way to Paul's room. It was time to begin my new role as a private nurse. The room was spacious and bright, yet it carried an air of neglect, as if no one truly cared about the family patriarch's condition. I approached his bed gently, calling out his name and telling him it was time for his medicine. There was no response. Worried, I took another step toward the bed, and what happened next was absolutely astounding. The elderly man, who had appeared frail and motionless moments ago, sat up in bed with surprising agility. He spoke in a strong, clear voice, saying that they were finally gone. It was a voice I could never have imagined coming from a man who was supposedly on his deathbed. I stood frozen, my mind racing to comprehend what was unfolding before my eyes. The man before me showed no signs of illness whatsoever. I remained rigid as stone, stunned by what had just transpired. Paul, whom Eric and Kathy had claimed was at death's door, sat before me, with an expression of pure lucidity, as if he had never been sick at all. His aged body harbored an unexpected intelligence and strength, his eyes gleaming with vitality. I stammered, unable to form complete sentences, struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. He gave a short laugh, a dry sound devoid of humor. He told me that I must be surprised, adding that there was much more to this family than I could imagine. My legs felt weak, as if gravity had suddenly multiplied its force. I sank into the chair beside his bed, trying to organize my scattered thoughts. After years of being manipulated by Eric and Kathy, now even Paul, whom I barely knew, seemed to harbor more secrets than anyone. I couldn't finish my sentence when I tried to confirm that he wasn't really sick, that everything had been. What he was telling me was too shocking for my mind to fully process. Paul sighed, his expression softening slightly. I asked him why he cared, why he was helping me, now after staying silent for so long. He sighed again, showing fatigue for the first time. Because, Rachel, Paul told me softly, I too was blind for many years. He explained how he had realized too late what kind of man his son had become, and how Kathy had shaped him. He admitted that he hadn't known how to correct his mistakes, so he had withdrawn instead. But now, he said, seeing what they were doing to me, he could no longer remain silent. He believed that I was the only one who could put an end to this. The room fell silent for a moment. As the afternoon breeze gently stirred the curtains, I felt the weight of the decision settling in my chest. Looking at Paul, I felt for the first time that he was an ally, someone who, like me, had suffered from Kathy and Eric's cruelty in his own way. I spoke with a strength in my voice that surprised even me, telling him I was ready. I told him I was tired of the humiliation, tired of being treated as if I had no value. I explained how they had taken everything from me and made me believe I was worthless. But if he truly believed we could change this, I was in. A slow smile spread across Paul's lips. He said he had known I would make the right decision. He reached out to me, with surprising strength for his age. He suggested we start planning. He pulled out a thick folder of documents from under his bed. When he opened the folder, a series of documents and photographs appeared. He revealed that these were the secrets Eric and Kathy had been hiding. He explained how he had been collecting evidence for months while pretending to be ill. Paul began showing me suspicious financial transactions, compromising emails, and photos of Eric with women other than Jasmine. With each turn of the page, new pieces of information were revealed, making my stomach twist. Eric hadn't just betrayed me, he had betrayed his company too. He had been diverting funds to support his luxurious lifestyle and mistresses. I asked about Kathy, dreading the answer. Paul let out a bitter laugh. He said she was even worse. She had been helping cover up Eric's betrayals and fraud. He explained that while Kathy thought she was protecting the family legacy, she was really just enabling her son's greed and cruelty. I felt as if the ground had disappeared from beneath my feet. My entire life had been built on lies. Kathy, who should have accepted me as family, had actually been plotting my downfall. And Eric, he turned out to be an even worse person than I had imagined. Paul closed the folder with a grave expression, telling me that the decision was mine to make. He explained that with this evidence, we could corner Eric and Kathy. But he warned me that I needed to be absolutely certain. He emphasized that once we started this, there would be no turning back. I stared at the documents before me, undeniable proof of Eric and Kathy's cruelty and greed. I felt something harden inside me, like steel being forged in fire. A cold determination took over my entire being, leaving no room for doubt. I responded with a voice strong with resolve, asking him what I needed to do. Paul's smile widened, and in that moment, I realized nothing would ever be the same after his confession. My world, which had already been crumbling, now shattered completely, but this time, I wasn't helpless among the ruins. I now possessed something I'd never had before. A weapon. It wasn't just the folder full of compromising documents Paul had shown me. It was the power that came from knowing Eric and Kathy's true faces, from seeing them for what they really were. They had looked down on me my entire life. Now it was my turn to take control. Paul and I spent days analyzing every detail he had gathered. We went through fraudulent financial transactions, Eric's inappropriate email exchanges, and even conversations between Kathy and her lovers. The evidence was solid and devastating, like a perfectly assembled puzzle of destruction. All we needed was to piece together these fragments and figure out how to set them in motion. It wasn't an easy task, but my resolve was unshakable. In his office, now covered with documents and photographs like some grotesque gallery of Eric's downfall, Paul told me we needed allies. The walls looked like a mural depicting Eric's impending doom, each piece of paper another nail in his coffin. Paul assured me that even just the two of us could inflict damage on them. However, he explained that with the right allies, we could bring them down completely. I questioned him hesitantly about these allies, wondering who would help someone like me. I doubted anyone would assist a woman isolated by this family. Everyone thought I was weak and voiceless, I told him. Paul fixed me with a penetrating gaze. He told me with conviction that there was nothing more powerful than this situation. Those who are underestimated, he said, are often the strongest, and I was precisely that person. He pointed out that while everyone thought I was being docile, they had no idea that I held all the cards. He was right. For years, I had grown accustomed to being invisible. But now, that very invisibility could be our path to victory. Paul compiled a list of people who had been harmed by Eric and Kathy. It included betrayed old associates, employees who had suffered under their tyranny, and friends who had been manipulated by this toxic family in various ways. These people were scattered, living in the shadows of the destruction Eric and Kathy had caused. Now was our chance for retribution. Paul pointed to a name on the list, Daniel. He explained that Daniel had been Eric's partner for years until false fraud allegations forced him out of the company. Since then, Daniel had lost everything. Paul emphasized that Daniel was key because he knew the company inside and out, and possessed knowledge of Eric's deepest secrets. With trembling hands but determination in my heart, I made my first call. Daniel answered quickly, his tired, raspy voice asking what I wanted. I explained that I knew what Eric had done to him, and that I too was a victim of manipulation. There was a moment of silence, but I could sense the seed of interest being planted. He asked why now, his voice tinged with slight mistrust. He questioned why I would suddenly change sides when I had been with them all along. I took a deep breath, steadying myself for what came next. I told Daniel firmly that I refused to be a prisoner anymore. I explained how I had been trampled on for years, watching my life crumble because of Eric and Kathy. But now, I told him, I knew the truth. I knew who they really were, and I had evidence to prove it. However, I needed help to corner them completely. I suggested that he, Daniel, might be the missing piece we needed. Daniel maintained silence for what felt like an eternity, and I feared he would refuse. But then he responded with a stronger voice, agreeing to help. He was the first of many to join our cause. From that moment, things began falling into place like perfectly aligned gears. Others who had been hurt by Eric and Kathy started emerging from the shadows, all eager to witness the downfall of those who had caused them so much pain. Paul and I worked tirelessly, day and night, building a true alliance of those who had been oppressed by this family. Meanwhile, I maintained my facade. I sent daily messages to Eric and Kathy, reporting on Paul's condition. With dark satisfaction, I wrote that his father was getting better. They had no idea that the man they thought was on his deathbed was right beside me, plotting their destruction. I asked Paul nervously if there was any chance they would discover our plan. He shook his head with certainty. He explained that they were blinded by their own arrogance. They thought they had already won, he said. They believed I was trapped here, powerless. They couldn't even imagine what we were doing. But maintaining the pretense was challenging. Each photo of Eric and Jasmine that arrived, every indifferent message from Kathy, only fueled the fire of my determination. They thought they held all the control, viewing me as their puppet. Yet they were walking straight into the trap we had set, completely unaware. Within days, we had everything we needed. Paul had contacted trusted lawyers, and preparations for legal action against Eric were in place. We were ready for the lawsuit against both Eric and Kathy. Meanwhile, Daniel provided us access to records of suspicious financial transactions that Eric had tried to hide for years. We had enough evidence to destroy both their personal lives and careers. When the final details were set, Paul called me into his office. He told me there was no turning back from what we were about to do. He asked if I was ready to proceed. I stared at the papers and documents scattered across the table. All the evidence proving Eric and Kathy's years of betrayal and manipulation lay before me like a road map of their destruction. My mind flashed back to every moment. Every insult I had to swallow, every humiliation they had forced me to endure, burned fresh in my memory. I felt anger coursing through my veins like liquid fire. But this wasn't a blind rage, it was cold, calculated, and focused, like a surgeon's knife ready to cut. I answered with unwavering determination that I was ready. I told him we would make them pay for everything. Paul smiled with satisfaction. He simply said, "Good." He added that tomorrow, when they returned, the moment of truth would come. That evening, as I left the office, I felt a mix of tension and anticipation churning inside me. We were on the brink of something momentous. It seemed unbelievable that in just hours, everything would change. Neither my life nor theirs would ever be the same again. That night, sleep eluded me almost entirely. My hands were clammy and my heart pounded like a drum in my chest. I knew the confrontation was near. Facing everything I had endured for years filled me with equal parts fear and exhilaration. By sunrise, I was already up, waiting for the endgame. The plan was in motion, and I knew there would be no going back after this day. The day had arrived. My heart was beating so hard, I could hear it echoing within me. Everything was in place. We had meticulously fine-tuned every detail to ensure nothing would go wrong. Paul and I spent the final hours reviewing the documents. These papers would serve as irrefutable evidence of Eric's betrayal and Kathy's manipulation. But what struck me most was the realization that there would be no going back after today. What had begun as a quest for justice had transformed into something far greater. Today, I was going to confront them in ways they could never have anticipated. Just before noon, I heard a car pulling up in front of the building. My nerves were at their breaking point, but I forced myself to maintain my composure. This was our one chance to set everything in motion, and I couldn't let my anxiety show. The apartment door opened, and there they were. Eric, Kathy, and of course, Eric's young mistress Jasmine, all radiating their usual air of superiority. Eric walked in with his trademark arrogant smile. He acted as if he owned everything around him, just as he always had. The Caribbean sun still glowed on his tanned skin, while Jasmine hung on his arm, laughing loudly and completely ignoring my presence. Eric greeted me in that false tone I had grown to hate, saying he could see I had managed to keep things running while they were away. I swallowed the rising anger in my throat and forced a smile. I welcomed them back, keeping my voice as light as I could manage. I pretended everything was in perfect harmony. I asked if they had enjoyed their vacation. Kathy looked me up and down with her usual contemptuous stare before throwing a malicious comment my way. She told me it had been wonderful. She said it was such a shame I couldn't join them. But someone had to take care of things here, didn't they? She added with mock sympathy. Before I could respond, Paul's door opened, and he walked out confidently. He was nothing like the helpless invalid they had expected to find. The shock on Eric's, Kathy's, and Jasmine's faces was a sight to behold. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence in the room was heavy and tense. Eric was the first to break the silence. His face was etched with disbelief. He stammered at his father, asking why and how this was possible. He seemed unable to comprehend what was happening. Paul's smile was cold and calculated. It was that same smile that assured me we were in control. Paul asked Eric if he was surprised to see him standing there. He added that they had been too caught up in their little schemes to notice he had been acting all along. Kathy turned pale, covering her mouth with her hand, stumbling backward as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. She tried to maintain her superior attitude while asking Paul what he meant, but her voice was trembling. Paul told her with contempt to stop playing innocent, saying he knew everything. Eric stepped forward, trying to regain his composure. He told his father that he didn't understand, that they were only trying to protect the company and the family. Paul cut him off, his voice thundering through the room like lightning. He asked if that's what Eric called protection, betraying his wife, manipulating company finances, and lying to everyone around him. I knew it was my moment. The time had come to confront them with everything. Everything we knew. Taking a deep breath, I stepped forward. I began in a voice that surprised me with its firmness, telling Eric that Paul was right. I told them we knew everything. Every secret he had tried to hide for years. Every moment he had made me feel worthless while enjoying himself with his mistresses. And how he had manipulated everyone's lives around him. Eric turned to face me. His eyes were wide with shock and panic. He stammered, asking if I had known all along. I nodded, feeling a dark satisfaction as I watched fear spread across his face. I told him that his father and I had plenty of time to talk while they were away. We had enough time for him to tell me everything he had discovered while pretending to be helpless for months. Jasmine, who had been silent until then, stepped forward. Her face flickered between fear and confusion, like a candle caught in a draft. She demanded to know what we were talking about. She turned to Eric, desperately asking him what was happening. Paul laughed. It was a cold sound, devoid of humor, like ice cracking in winter. He told Jasmine not to worry. He said he had some surprises prepared especially for her. He moved to the desk and picked up a folder. He suggested we should start with something specific. He mentioned the emails between her and her lawyer, detailing plans to secure a substantial portion of Eric's assets after their divorce. Jasmine turned pale, looking desperately at Eric. She tried to tell him she could explain. Before she could continue, Kathy exploded in rage. She screamed for us to stop, her voice trembling with fury. She demanded Paul to stop immediately, trying to tell him he had no right. Paul cut her off with a voice sharp as a blade, telling her he had every right. He declared this was his house, his company, his family. He pointed at Eric and Kathy. He told them they had spent years deceiving him, manipulating him, and lying to him. He stated that it was over. I seized this moment to speak. I told Eric I wanted a divorce. The silence that followed was deafening, like the quiet before a storm. Eric stared at me with shock and disbelief. He asked if I was joking, reminding me of everything he claimed to have done for me. I laughed bitterly, a sound as hollow as my marriage had been. It was a laugh devoid of any joy. I asked him if he meant the betrayals, lies, and humiliation. Was that what he'd done for me? I told him firmly that he hadn't done anything for me. He had only shown me exactly what kind of man he truly was. I turned to face Kathy. She stared at me with a mixture of rage and fear in her eyes. I confronted her about how she had treated me like an inferior being for years. I reminded her how she had always said I wasn't good enough for her precious son. I asked her, with bitter satisfaction, if she could now see who truly wasn't good enough. Before Kathy could respond, Paul threw a stack of folders onto the coffee table. He announced that here was all the evidence. He said it contained every betrayal, every lie, and every penny they had misappropriated. He stated that everything was there. Eric, Kathy, and Jasmine stared at the documents as if they were looking at a ticking time bomb. Eric's jaw trembled slightly, and his voice came out low and hoarse. He asked what we wanted. I exchanged glances with Paul before answering. I told them I wanted them to lose everything. Just as they had tried to make me lose everything. Paul continued with our plan. He informed Eric that he was out of the company, effective immediately. He told Kathy she had to leave the house today. Then he turned to Jasmine. She was visibly trembling. He suggested she direct her ambitions elsewhere. He told her that her scheme was over. The chaos that followed was, in a way, satisfying. Eric alternated between threats and pleading while Kathy sobbed and begged Paul to reconsider. And Jasmine, well, she remained silent. Her eyes darted back and forth nervously, like a cornered animal who knew its fate was sealed. As everything unfolded around me, I remained silent, watching. The show that Paul and I had carefully orchestrated was finally playing out, and I knew with absolute certainty I would never again be the woman they had humiliated. The silence after the confrontation hung heavy in the air, like a thick fog that wouldn't lift. Everything Paul and I had planned unfolded before me like a cruel theater production. I, who had once been the obedient, invisible wife, now watched Eric, Kathy, and Jasmine's downfall with a mixture of relief and strange sadness. They had hurt me, made me feel worthless, and now they were paying the price. But that price didn't come without its own weight. I had won, but victory tasted bitter in my mouth. Kathy was the first to break the silence. She moved toward Paul with tears of desperation glistening in her eyes. She begged him, reminding him that she was his wife and that he couldn't do this to her. She insisted they could work things out as a family. She claimed she had only been trying to protect their son. Paul looked at her with contempt I had never seen in him before. He asked her if she called this protecting Eric. He told her she had molded Eric into her own image, shaped by her greed and manipulation. He said it had all started with her. He admitted he had stayed silent for too long. But now, he declared, it was over. He stated that what she had done to me, and to him, was unforgivable. Kathy fell to her knees before us, pleading through her tears. But I felt no sympathy. For years, she had looked down on me, treating me like a shadow in Eric's life, an inferior being. Now the tables had turned, and she was the one begging for mercy. Paul told her in a firm, unforgiving voice that she no longer had a place in this house. He ordered her to leave today. He declared it was over. She looked at me, seeking some kind of support, but I only stared back coldly. There was nothing left to say. All the insults, all the humiliation had finally come back to her. Eric, who had seemed lost in a whirlwind of emotions, suddenly stepped forward. His expression of despair was replaced by blind rage, his eyes sparking with hatred. He warned me that I would regret this. He swore that neither his father nor I would escape unscathed. He declared that we couldn't take the company from him. He insisted that we couldn't throw him out of his house. I looked at him, with a mixture of pity and contempt. I told him that he had lost all rights when he chose to betray me, when he saw me as nothing but an accessory to his life. I informed him that the company was no longer his. I added that this house had never truly been his either. I told him he had lost everything. And I reminded him that he had no one to blame but himself. Eric tried to argue, attempting to convince me there was still time to change things. But my resolve was firm. There was no room for reconciliation anymore. He stared at me, his anger melting into pleading, but his voice was nothing more than a distant echo to me now. He softened his voice, almost begging as he called my name. He claimed he could change. He insisted he could make things work. I took a deep breath and responded with a coldness that surprised even me. I reminded him that he'd had years to be the husband he'd promised to be. But he hadn't been. I told him there was no going back now. He shook his head as if he couldn't believe this was really happening. Eric looked at Paul. He looked like a child still hoping for his father's support. But Paul just stared back at him, quietly, firmly, and without mercy. Jasmine, who had been silently watching everything unfold, finally spoke up with a trembling voice. Jasmine asked Eric what he was going to do now. Her voice was pitiful, just a shadow of the confident woman she had once been. She stared at him, desperately. She looked at him as if expecting some magical solution to escape this situation. But all that remained was despair. Eric replied in a broken voice that he didn't know. He kept repeating that he didn't know what to do. I spoke up with a strong voice, telling him that perhaps it was time for him to find his true self without lies and manipulation. I reminded him that there were no more secrets to hide. I told him his world of pretense was over. Paul ended the discussion decisively. He ordered them to pack their belongings and leave by the end of the day. He announced that everything left behind would be donated. He stated there was no room for negotiation. He declared that both the house and company would continue without them. With that, he turned and left the room. Jasmine, who had once been so proud of her position by Eric's side, now stood lost, unsure of what to do or where to go. I followed Paul out, leaving them in the ruins of their own making. As the office door closed behind us, the weight of everything hit me like a tidal wave. Paul approached me and placed his hand on my shoulder with an approving smile. He told me I had done what needed to be done. He added that everything they had built, all the lies that had supported their lifestyle, had now crumbled. I couldn't help but let out a deep sigh. I asked him what would happen now. He spoke in a gentler voice, telling me that I was free now. Those words hung in the air like a delicate wind chime. I was free. I was liberated from the constraints Eric and Kathy had placed on me, free from their lies, betrayal, and humiliation. For the first time in years, I felt like I had reclaimed my life. Yet freedom had a bittersweet taste. The downfall of Eric and Kathy gave me a sense that justice had been served, but it also made me aware of an emptiness within myself. I had spent so much time fighting for revenge, and now that it was all over, I wasn't quite sure what to do next. In the days that followed, I witnessed Eric and Kathy's complete destruction. The company that had once been Eric's pride was now under investigation. The fraudulent transactions that Paul and I had exposed not only ruined his career but destroyed any chance of redemption. Meanwhile, Kathy desperately tried to salvage her reputation, but no one would listen to her anymore. The world they had so desperately tried to maintain crumbled around them. Jasmine simply disappeared. She probably realized her plan to become the new Mrs. Eric had failed spectacularly and decided to cut her losses. I didn't miss her at all, nor did I care where she went. Like Eric and Kathy, she was no longer a part of my life. That week, I finalized my divorce. In court, I faced Eric, who looked defeated, a mere shadow of the confident man I had once known. He tried to argue once, attempting to convince the judge that things weren't as they appeared, but the evidence was against him. The judge was brief and direct. The divorce was granted, and with it, the last ties binding me to Eric were severed. As I left the courthouse, I felt the weight lifting from my shoulders. Paul was waiting outside, and his gentle smile reminded me that I had survived it all. He simply said it was over. I nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion wash over me. I agreed softly that yes, it was finally over. As we walked toward the car together, Paul turned to me with a curious look. He asked me what I planned to do next. I looked up at the sky, feeling the warm sun on my face, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. I was free. Free not just from Eric, but from everything he and Kathy had represented in my life. For the first time, I had complete control over my own destiny. With a small smile playing on my lips, I told him what came next. I said I would live life my own way now. And with that, I left the courthouse and all the painful memories it represented behind me. An uncertain future stretched before me, but for the first time, it was completely my own. After hearing my story, I have something I want to ask you. If you were in my position, would you have found the courage to face all of this and fight for your freedom? Or would you have remained bound by fear and pain, trapped in a life of humiliation?